Ruth. Over to you, Richard.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, it's almost 2 a.m. here, so I'm not going to be at my sharpest or best. So advance apologies, but I'll try to squeeze in as much as I can within the next 5 to 10 minutes. First of all, thank you very much to Cherry and folks at Harvard Law School's Human Rights Center. I really enjoyed our conference back in 2018. Perhaps I've attended more international conferences on populism and all than the electoral colleges by Mr. Trump, but that was really something that stood out, and I'm glad that this project has come out. And I really appreciate comments by Cesar and Ruth on the book and issues that we have to discuss, and I completely agree with that. Now, Dostoevsky said in The Possessed that, in times of turbulent change and transition, all sorts of foul characters come to the fore. And I think the unfortunate thing is that even though Biden may have edged out a little bit Trump in the latest elections, the turbulent times are still ahead of us. Therefore, I think to say that we're over the populist age is not only misleading, but it could be very dangerously complacent. There are 5 things I want to talk about very quickly. The first thing, and I try to discuss that also in the opening paragraphs of my chapter in the book, is authoritarian patronage and sharp power. So last year, I spent a lot of time in Taipei as a visiting scholar. And in the United States, there's a lot of discussion about Russian disinformation campaign. This is also a very strong element in European elections and politics. But one of the things that we're seeing in Asia and in Southeast Asia is more and more sharp power operations by China, whether in Chinese majority places like Taiwan or Singapore, but my fear is that increasingly also in other places like the Philippines. For instance, Facebook the other month cracked down on more than 100 different accounts that were generating pro-Duterte, pro-populist, and pro-Chinese position all the way from Fujian in China. And the Philippines is also heading towards its own election season. And my fear is that what happened in places like Taiwan back in 2018, where their parliamentary elections was very much victimized by Chinese sharp power operation and disinformation campaign, could also happen to us, especially in more fragile democracies in Southeast Asia, whereby we may not have the kind of strategic learning that the Taiwanese government had, which enabled them in 2020 elections to do a better job in protecting the integrity of their elections from sharp power operations. And we know that historically, democratic patronage by United States and the European Union was very important in the third wave democratization in Asia, in Southern Europe, in Latin America, among others. And the problem right now is that even though we may have a more democratic or liberal leaning president in the United States, our sense is this is going to be a crisis president, a public health crisis, an economic crisis, and the post-election mayhem in the US perhaps will stay with us for some time. So honestly, as much as many people were, heaving a sigh of relief after the US elections, many are wondering whether Biden can really carry the torch of liberalism and encourage counter-populist wave across the world, including places like the Philippines, whereby I think President Duterte was not very happy with the result of the elections. The second thing that I talked about in my chapter, and I've been emphasizing over the past few years, is that we need to talk about varieties of populism. And one way to look at it is in a much more binary West versus East. Again, it's very simplistic in many ways, and there are degrees of populism, as Jerry and other experts have talked about. But I think one thing that I have focused on is what I call emerging market populism. Democracy, populism in emerging market democracies. So these are countries with at least a half a generation or generation of fair and competitive elections, and at the same time, countries that have been growing above average over the past 10 to 15 years. So countries like India, countries like Indonesia, countries like Philippines, and to a certain degree, Brazil also come to mind, not to mention Turkey, although these countries have suffered some economic backsliding over the past 5 to 6 years or so. But nonetheless, we're talking about among the most promising economies on earth, and supposedly fledgling democracies that are now in grip of populism. And what's interesting is that while in the West or established democracies, populism has been driven by anti-immigration sentiment, or in Rust Belts of the US or in rural fronts by dissatisfaction with globalization, the ironic thing is that we see the rise of populism in places like the Philippines and India and Indonesia, whereby actually these are countries who have been winners of globalization over the past decade or so. These are countries where there's no anti-immigration sentiment anywhere close to what we see in the West. If anything, these are countries who have been welcoming to immigrants, whether it's Rohingyans from Myanmar or whether it has been the Syrians and others in cases like Turkey. So the dynamic has been very different, whereby the root and the depth of discontent, as Ruth was mentioning a while ago, actually comes with respect to bureaucratic efficiency concerns. with respect to public services, with respect to unequal distribution of newly created growth. So we see quite a different dynamic. And in terms of constituency, it's also very interesting to see that while the blue collar or the less fortunate economic classes have been driving right-wing authoritarian populism in the West, in the case of Philippines or Indonesia or India or even Turkey earlier, and to a certain degree, I would say even in Bolsonaro's case, we see it's actually the middle class or the aspirational middle class who has been the core constituencies of these populists that we have been talking about. And I think that's what also makes it quite different in terms of the dynamics that we see here. The third element that I want to focus hard on here is this. Back in the 1980s and 90s, there was a discussion about Asian values. So you had relatively articulate statesmen like Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore and Mahathir, leaders who were overseeing massive economic growth, coming out and saying, we're Asian countries, community values is much more important than individual rights. And in our case, whether it's Confucian or other kind of philosophies that we're trying to attribute their argument to, their argument is that there's no distinction between the state and the civil society, that the idea that there's an independent and autonomous civil society that should check the excesses of the state, that's an alien idea from the West. In our societies, the two are one. We are a communitarian, integrated nation-state system. Of course, that argument was doing well until the Asian financial crisis happened. And then suddenly Lee Kuan Yew and the Mahathirs were not in a very good position. And then, of course, Mahathir had to step down in early 2000s. And the same thing with Lee Kuan Yew, kind of semi-demoting to a mentor minister. What we see in the past 5 to 10 years is a much more troubling version of this. I call it Asian Values 2.0, whereby you have people like Rodrigo Duterte, but also other prominent leaders in the region. I mean, they're literally just two democracies in Southeast Asia, Philippines and Indonesia, and together they're half of the region in terms of population. We see both leaders, Jokowi and Duterte, emphasizing rather than law and order, order and law. The emphasis is personal security. And if that means overcoming or actually dispensing with rule of law, then so be it, because that's the way forward. And I think this is and what we see also here is this. While Mahathir and Lee Kuan Yew definitely try to be a kind of a bridge between China and the West, or try to have a certain degree of civility in their interaction with the West, comparatively, what we see with people like President Duterte right now, and even some of the leaders in Southeast Asia, like sometimes in the case of Prayut or in the case of Hun Sen, they have been quite aggressively lashing out at the West. There's a greater sense of confidence. And I think that also comes from the fact that, as I mentioned in issue number 1, there is authoritarian patronage. They feel that they have the support of countries like Russia and China behind them. So that makes them much more confident in standing up to the West, especially when the West itself is going through its own democratic crisis and economic trials. The fourth factor, and I think that's very important in the context of COVID-19, is this. Earlier this year, we were discussing, will populism be hurt by the COVID-19 or not? Because, most of these populists are masters of performative governance, right? They're very good in symbolizing efficiency. But this is no joke. As we saw in the case of the United States, populism was, the naked emperor was exposed, right? So many were saying that, well, now it seems these strong men and effective leaders are not seeming very strong anymore. But at the same time, I think a lot of us underestimated, populist learning and authoritarian innovation, whereby we see, as the character in Game of Thrones said, chaos is a ladder. We see these populist leaders using fear and anxiety and uncertainty to actually consolidate power, to suppress the opposition. In the case of the Philippines, suddenly you had the shutdown of the biggest liberal media network. You had the very questionable conviction of one of the most famous liberal journalists in the Philippines, Maria Ressa. All of that happened in the shadow of emergency powers while COVID-19 was coming to being. So that's the worry that this kind of a Carl Schmittian state of exception has been used to hammer down the opposition, and not to mention cash handouts. Fiscal measures used by populists is also now used to build their own new networks of patronage. Instead of actually hurting them, now people are becoming even more dependent on state resources to survive very difficult economic circumstances. If you look at the IMF projection, the countries who are worst hit by the economically by the crisis are Philippines, India, and a little bit down the rankings, Indonesia. So I think that actually gives more strength in terms of fiscal leveraging on the part of populists to consolidate power. And lastly, I can see our good moderator is already looking at me, is it's what's the future of democracy, especially in emerging market democracies. You see, what we're looking at here is really varieties of democracy, right? I think Duterte's or Modi's or Bolsonaro's are what I call consummate populists. They use populism as style. They use populism in terms of political mobilization, but they also use populism once they're in power. They really do crazy things that they promise to do, whether it's, the wall, strict immigration policies by Trump, or the drug war, scorched earth drug war of President Duterte. But what we're seeing right now in the kind of short attention span digital populist environment that we have is this, that the competitive candidates for the future of power in places like the Philippines, among others, are leaders who are not fully populist, but use certain elements, style of populism to project themselves. In a way, what we're seeing is that populism or populist style is almost the only game in town. And that has made it very difficult for classical, liberal, democratic, civil society mobilization to make much of a dent the way we were able to do in the early days of third wave democratization and the people power revolution we had in 1980s. So I think as much as the populists have been engaging in their own learning and innovation, it's very important for supporters of democracy and civil liberties to also engage in their own kind of innovation. And if that means a certain degree of populist style in terms of messaging, not necessarily in terms of policy and mobilization, then maybe that could be one of the temptations that we're seeing forward. And last, I just forgot to say this, that one thing that really worries me is when, if you look at surveys like the Pew survey in 2007 and 18, in fact, from 2014 onwards, shows that 6, 7, or 8 out of 10 individuals in places like India, Indonesia, and Philippines have said that we are willing to have an authoritarian leader who doesn't bother with checks and balances as long as that person provides basic public services. And we see that disaffection with human rights, with due process, is also because of not only weak state public services, but the weakness of the penal system, but the brokenness of the judicial system. And that's why the way forward, the best way to sell human rights is to show that due process can work. And that's where classic capacity building and investment in judicial reform and state institution is also extremely important. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Jerry. Oh, Jerry, I need you to unmute.
Thank you. Thank you to the audience, and thank you to the panelists. They know I have learned a great deal from them in studying populism since 2017, and I'm continuing to learn today. Richard, who just spoke, wrote a chapter in the book, which I think is very important in emphasizing, as he did today, the diversity of causes of populism in different countries, and the absence of a uniform understanding of where populism comes from and how it might need to be dealt with. As Cesar said at the beginning, the understanding of populism that I have found most useful and persuasive for understanding what we're living through in the current time is what political scientists call the ideational approach. Populists who claim to speak for the will of the real people, vilifying elites and marginal groups that the elites protect, and seeking to govern without constraint. But I really do want to emphasize this seeking to govern without constraint, because that's the factor which distinguishes those who use populism as a rhetorical style some of the time, as virtually every democratic politician at some point does, and those who really pose a systematic threat to human rights. Once in power, ideational populists of both the left wing and the right wing endanger the human rights of their own citizens and the human rights of their own supporters, and threaten the international system for the protection of human rights everywhere. They often ally themselves with fully authoritarian states, which I must admit pose even greater threats to human rights than populists do. It's the troubling rise of populists in states that used to be democratic supporters of the human rights system, which grabbed my attention. Now, international human rights bodies and international human rights NGOs cannot solve the problem of populism, but they can aid local actors in resisting and in overcoming its appeal. The focus of the international system needs to include the characteristic violations that populists commit, including manipulation of electoral systems, undermining of checks and balances, and attacks on civil society. I don't think that the book is inconsistent with the idea that there needs to be an aggressive defense of populism, but rather that the aggressive defense can't be conducted by the international human rights system. The international system needs to support local actors who have the legitimacy to engage in the aggressive defense. The conflict of ideas must ultimately be won by local actors at the national level. They have local discourses that they can employ to sway local public opinion instead of or alongside the more generalized and neutral international human rights discourse. These general lessons can hopefully be applied once President Biden is inaugurated in the United States, although it will be in the midst of a pandemic and apparently in a divided society with a divided government. Populism has lost one election, but it's not going away in the United States. The new administration will have a lot of work to do to restore democratic pluralism and common purpose at home. And the public health and economic crises here will demand attention to economic and social rights in the United States, as it does elsewhere. Returning to the rule of law and fortifying democracy in the United States will be best accomplished by re-emphasizing the country's own democratic and egalitarian values, and by vindicating truthfulness after 4 years of Trumpian fraud. The United States needs both candor going forward in government and, I believe, full disclosure of the actions of the prior regime and the consequences of those actions. Recovery from populist governance in the United States and other countries is likely not to be quick or easy. Attention to the comparative course of populism and the international context should be useful to those efforts, and I hope that this book helps in that. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Professor Newman. So like Professor Newman just said to the attendees today, we do encourage you to use the Q&A function to ask questions to our panelists. In the meantime, we do have a comment from the audience. The comment is, I think it would be helpful to sharpen the distinction between earlier quote unquote strongmen like Ferdinand Marcos and present day quote unquote strongmen like Rodrigo Duterte, to cite this one example. Panelists, any thoughts on this?
Maybe because it's my president involved. Okay. Maybe I can just pitch in very quickly on this, and I'm sure Cesar, Ruth, and Jerry can say something about it. Actually, I've been pondering this distinction for quite some time. I mean, at some point I said whether Duterte is a kind of a postmodern version of Marcos, in a sense that this is more about symbolism and the simulacra and performativeness that I think was not as much there with Marcos. Perhaps there was much with Imelda, the wife, but not as much with Ferdinand Marcos himself. Now, there's a shallow similarity between the two. They're both lawyers, so ironically, our too few lawyers in the past 5 decades among our presidents are among the most authoritarian. So maybe there's something with the legal education in the Philippines that we have to review. But no offense meant to our legal experts and friends here. No, I think one of the things that I look at is what do these leaders do with the Constitution, right? I think the more journalistic way of looking at it is like Farid Zakaria's notion of illiberal democracy, right? I mean, in the case of Marcos, he totally changed the Constitution. He engaged in what political scientists call autogalpe, right? So he self-could, changed the constitution, and then effectively he neutered democratic elections by putting most of the opposition in jail. Duterte did not exactly do that. He has neither changed the constitution. Most of the opposition are still out or free, although they're facing harassment. You can criticize him without fearing that you may end up dead right away the next day, the way that it was during the Marcos day. So there's some important distinction there whereby Duterte has not even bothered to change the constitution. He has just worked around it by using this kind of penal populism to say we're in a state of emergency, forget about the constitution, it's just a piece of paper, even though he himself is a trained lawyer and had to pass the bar. So I think that's where he's more menacing and at the same time, less menacing. It's less menacing in the sense that it's possible that Duterte will not artificially extend his stay in power beyond 2022, but most likely he'll try to put an anointed successor, whether it's consigliere, Rasputin kind of advisor, or whether his daughter, Sara Duterte. But unlike Marcos, I don't think we're going to look at the 10, 20, 30 years of Duterte presidency as in the past. The second, I think, important element also here is civil-military relations. Again, here, I think the case of Duterte is a little bit less menacing than that of Marcos, because in the case of Marcos, he spent, prior to becoming dictator and declaring martial law, he spent 3 to 4 years consistently courting the military by quadrupling their budget, by putting in his own cousins and friends, including a former president, Fidel Ramos, who I talked to about this issue. So he really packed the top leadership of the military, and essentially, political scientists have a term for this. He created subjective control over the armed forces. And once he achieved that, he could essentially use the armed forces as a hammer and get his way through. My assessment, based on surveys, qualitative, quantitative study of the armed forces of the Philippines, is that they have not been totally co-opted by Duterte. That Duterte has faced tremendous amount of resistance precisely because the military did not want to repeat the mistake of the past. There has been a lot of efforts done to professionalize the military. This is a military that is close to the United States and the international community in the sense that they want to get aid. So if ever, they engage in the drug war or massive human rights violation, their own institutional interest and their own self-identity could come under questions. Unfortunately, though, in the case of the Philippine National Police and the law enforcers in the Philippines, they have been much more co-opted by President Duterte, and they have been more or less the hounds that have been unleashed to the killing fields.
I'll just add very quickly that the chronology varies from region to region, and the book in the introductory chapter, Jerry talks about the potential duration of this populist wave, right? Hoping that it would be the time of populism, but not the age of populism. And I do hope that that's the case. I still think that this is not going to be with us for a whole generation, but it's not a glitch. It's not just a 5-year glitch. And the way that I would see the difference between, say, the Marcoses of the world, the way that Richard described Marcos sounds very familiar to me, and immediately think of Fujimori. Fujimori in Peru was the kind of strong man that the right-wing movements in the rest of Latin America wanted to have, and unfortunately, many countries got a version of Fujimori either from the left or the right. But the key difference there, and I'll just highlight this difference, is I agree with Richard, the relation with the military. So back, at least in Latin America, it would be the military itself that would take over power. So it would be a military coup, right? Or it would be some sort of negotiation between the political elites and the military by essentially giving money and key positions to the military. The second wave, and what I do think has happened, is that this virus of just like a COVID of populism has mutated. So one thing that we've seen in the more recent wave, and the one depicted in my slide, is that many of these leaders have worked within the confines of the constitutional architecture, and I think that the mastermind of this has been actually Viktor Orban, a small country, 10 million people, but he came up with the term of illiberal democracy early on. So that's what to me is most striking, that many of these leaders, and also you could say that Erdogan did a little bit of this in Turkey, have managed to either change the rules of the game or patiently chip away at the foundations of the rule of law to stay in power. But those incremental moves in the end have amounted in many of these places to qualitative changes towards something that's no longer recognizable as democracy, like in the case of Hungary or Venezuela or many of these countries.
And of course, just to add to that, I mean, I think that those are both important observations and responses by Richard and Cesar. But, I think that to Jerry's earlier point, the fact that there's a pivot even to the military reflects something quite fundamental about the time that we are in. And that is a recognition that somehow the greatest source of power is not democracy per se, but actual force, the capacity to wield democratic will in an office, the office of the president, and to utilize it through the military. That tells us something, because I think for many human rights practitioners and scholars, last decade has perhaps proven that the idea that force as a means of sovereign expression and as a legitimate exercise of power is actually not at all a distant proposition. So I think these are really important signposts in the field and for the field. The second thing to note is, of course, in sub-Saharan Africa in particular, this has become very much, as Richard pointed out about Singapore, this has become the norm. The idea that human rights might limit the exercise of a sovereign or a president who assumes power with constitutional legitimacy, constrained by human rights, is actually as foreign as genuine kind of liberal democracy in these regions. And I think that then presses the point that Jerry makes in the book about the importance of human rights institutions and monitoring, the idea that rather than focusing on the characterization of whether or not a regime is populist, focus instead on the nature of the human rights violations that are particularly attendant to populist regimes, so that the universality and the consistency of human rights is not abandoned in the project of what might otherwise be a legitimate constitutional administration, be it in the UK or in the US or Europe or South America or Latin America. And I think this is fairly significant. The last point I would say is to emphasize Richard's point about the kinds of responses to human rights arguments, responses grounded in collectivism versus individualism, the weaknesses, as I mentioned earlier, of liberal democracy and what that means in the face of citizenship, that can deploy its will to curtail the human rights of the other. And these questions of legitimacy are not questions that the field has been particularly good at grappling with and at offering solutions for. And this has got to become a significant clarion call for the field and for scholars in the field.
Thank you, Professor Akeji. So I do realize that we are at time right now. And before we continue, I just want to check panelists if you have time for one more question, or if not, and you have other engagements. I see a thumbs up. I see some nodding. Okay, great. We will take one more question and then end for today. So our next question, a question about terminology. How would one respond to David Art's recent argument that support for Trump, Orban, Modi, etc. barely comes from populism, economic grievance against elites, but instead overwhelmingly from nativism, racism, xenophobia, and that using the former term unwittingly provides moral cover for the latter, confer Johnson's chapter in the book?
Well,
Well, I'll say first, I'm sorry. I'll say first that exclusionary populism, which is one of the terminologies that I use, as opposed to democratic populism, which is what Douglas Johnson argues for in the book, may not have the emotive force of calling something straightly racist or nativist, but it's the same concept. The exclusion of part of the people from being the real people, the declaration of part of the citizenry as illegitimate participants in the process, undeserving of the concern of the government. That's what we're talking about here. And so I think as an analytical method, understanding it as populism, which has relations to other forms of populism that take place in the world, is in fact extremely helpful. It may not be the right emotional language to use in political debate. And it may also not be the right legal language to use. I argue, perhaps very vehemently in the book, that human rights institutions should not try to make populism a legal wrong. What they should focus on is the legal wrongs that are going on underneath populism, because the content of populism and the identification of populists is in fact too contested for it to be a useful tool for legal analysis as opposed to external analysis of legal phenomena. But there it has a great deal of heuristic value. And the terms in which the defects of populists need to be debated in public debate of a general vernacular kind, well, that requires a different vocabulary. And I think it's entirely consistent to say that the analytic exercise is a different exercise than the public rhetorical exercise.
That might be a great place for us to stop. Thank you all so much for being with us today. So interesting. I've learned a lot from all of you. So thank you for sharing your insight into this important topic of populism and human rights. So thank you very much. I hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon.